Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to begin the evening's proceedings. A very good evening to you all. Thank you for being here. My name is Rob Havers, the President and CEO of this wonderful American Civil War Museum. And on behalf of the American Civil War Museum and our Board of Trustees, let me extend a very warm welcome to all of you here to our historic Tredegar campus. A special welcome this evening to the Commonwealth of Virginia's Secretary for Education, Amy Gudera. Thank you for being here tonight. And to her husband, Bill, as well as the Deputy Secretary of Education, Emily Ann Gullickson, members of the Virginia General Assembly, Delegate Betsy Carr, Delegate Mark Sickles, and Senator Hashmi. Thank you for being here. Also, round of applause. A round of applause. The president of Christopher Newport University, Admiral Retired William J. Kelly, representatives from his team, members of the staff of the Governor of Virginia, and colleagues from cultural institutions and museums across Richmond and Virginia. Thank you all for being here for what is an auspicious moment, our first annual Lincoln Prize lecture. In years to come, you can say you were here for Lincoln Prize Lecture number 1. This is an event recognizing this year's winners, 2023, of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History Lincoln Prize. A prize awarded to the finest scholarly work in English on Abraham Lincoln, the American Civil War soldier, or the American Civil War era. It is one of, if not the, most prestigious awards for writing on the Civil War period. We are delighted to partner with Gilder Lehrman, an organization that has done so much to encourage the study and understanding of American history. We are delighted to partner with them in this endeavor. This signature event signals a new era for the American Civil War Museum, one in which we step onto a national stage in our efforts to encourage a better understanding of the causes, the course, and the consequences of the war that remade this country, that remade America, the American Civil War. For more than 100 years, the American Civil War Museum and its founding entities have preserved and shaped the memory of that conflict and underscored the significance to thousands upon thousands of Americans, young and old. In February of 2024, we will debut our newest temporary exhibition entitled The Impending Crisis, as part of our Remaking America initiatives and on the weekend of our annual symposium. This major new exhibition will explore the complex origins of the war and dovetail with our existing exhibitions, educational programs, and public programs. I hope to see all of you at one of these events and certainly at our exhibition opening. At the American Civil War Museum, we are fond of quoting the English novelist L.P. Hartley and the epigraph from his novel The Go-Between, that, as Hartley says, the past is a foreign country and they do things differently there. To that end, and in all things, the American Civil War Museum endeavors to understand the past as the past knew itself, not as we might prefer to know it from the vantage point of the present. And in seeking to provide that exposition, however, we also seek to challenges of perceptions of that past and to bring to life history in as engaging and dynamic a fashion as we possibly can. This evening is part of that ambition. No pressure, Dr. White. So now, without further delay, let me introduce our speaker for this evening. This year's Lincoln Prize was shared between two outstanding recipients, John Meacham for his work on Abraham Lincoln, and we hope to bring Mr. Meacham to speak later in the year. But Dr. Jonathan White received the Lincoln Prize for his outstanding book, A House Built by Slaves, African-American Visitors to the Lincoln White House. Dr. Jonathan White, Professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University, is the author and editor of 16 additional books on the Civil War era. He is a familiar face, we are delighted to say, at the American Civil War Museum, at our programs and our teacher institutes, and is very popular with our constituency. It is a great pleasure to welcome him here this evening as a Lincoln Prize winner. After delivering his keynote lecture, I know you're keen, 30 more seconds, Dr. White. After delivering his keynote lecture, Dr. White will then be joined by Dr. Ed Ayers, the 2018 Lincoln Prize winner, for a discussion and to entertain your questions. And now, without further ado, Professor Jonathan White.
Let me turn this on. Or should I just speak through this? What would you prefer? Sound fine? Okay. Sorry for jumping the gun there. Let me go back. All right. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. I love coming to this place. I got to speak at the grand opening a number of years ago. I forget what year that was. It's been a while. And I've spoken here every summer for the last 4 years with Christopher Newport University, hosting a teacher workshop and then also speaking at the museums. And the work being done here is just so important, and I'm so thrilled to be a part of it. I want to thank you for having me and for hosting this wonderful evening. Thank you all for coming out. I want to thank my president, Bill Kelly, and my provost, Quentin Kidd, for coming. Quentin actually came to New York for the Lincoln Prize event, so he got to hear the 10-minute version of tonight's talk. I said, don't worry, tonight you get the full 2 hours. So that's why I jumped the gun a little early. This book actually started as a collection of letters from African Americans to Lincoln. In 2014, I started collecting letters from black men and women to Abraham Lincoln, and my original idea was to put them into a book with the subtitle African American Correspondence and Conversations with Abraham Lincoln. And actually, now that I think about it, I talked about this at the American Civil War Museum Symposium many years ago over at the Library of Virginia. John Koska, you invited me, and thank you for that. These are some of the men who wrote to Abraham Lincoln, and I say men, there were thousands of signatures on letters and petitions to Lincoln, and over 1,000 were signed by black men. I have also found 20 or 21 written by black women, but I have not yet found any images of any of those women. So here you see some of the men who wrote to Abraham Lincoln, and I imagine that some of these faces, especially in a crowd like this, look familiar. So at the top center, you all probably recognize Frederick Douglas. The rest of the faces might be less familiar, but in their day, some of these were very prominent people. Some of them were ministers of the gospel, were soldiers, were chaplains. A few of these men went on to serve in Congress during Reconstruction. One of my favorites is this guy here, Paschal Randolph. He was born in Manhattan, grew up in the Five Points neighborhood. If you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, that's the area he grew up in. He was orphaned at a young age and grew up on the streets of Manhattan, and he actually grew up to become a spiritualist and a sex magician. And if you want to know what that means, you're going to have to pick up a copy of the book, because I'm not going to tell you tonight. But these are some of the people who wrote to Lincoln, and I began collecting these letters, and I found that they wrote to Lincoln about all manner of different topics. Whatever was on their minds, for the first time in American history, they believed that the President of the United States was concerned with what concerned them. And they also saw themselves as citizens, and they knew that they had a First Amendment right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so a great transformation took place during the Civil War, where black men and women write to Lincoln about their needs and their issues, and they believe that the president will listen to them. And I want to show you a couple of the letters that Lincoln received. This is one of my favorites, and it's actually fitting that we look at this here in Richmond. This was written by a man named Hannibal Cox. Hannibal Cox was born into slavery in Powhatan County, Virginia, grew up here in Richmond. When the Civil War began, he escaped, and he wound up joining a regiment of U.S. colored troops. Prior to the Civil War, he had been denied an education because it was illegal for African Americans in Virginia to learn how to read and write. But as a soldier, the white soldiers around him taught him and other black men how to read. And Hannibal Cox was so proud of the fact that he was learning to read and write that he wanted his commander-in-chief to know. So on March 30th, 1864, he wrote out this letter to Abraham Lincoln. He described being born here in this area in the darkness of slavery, but now that he was a soldier, he was gaining literacy. And he then took a copy of Harper's Weekly, which had a poem about the flag of the Union, and the bulk of this letter is actually him copying out that poetry to show his patriotic pride in the cause in which he was serving. But the most touching part of this letter is actually at the very bottom, right here. You've got a little postscript that he marked off in a little box. And Hannibal Cox wrote, "I sends this for you to look at. You must not laugh at it." And I love that sentiment because we all know as human beings we have a natural inclination to laugh at people when they make a careless or silly mistake. And Hannibal Cox understood that, and he knew that his penmanship wasn't perfect, although I wish more of my students wrote this clearly. He knew that he might have spelling or grammatical mistakes, and he knew that Lincoln's natural inclination might be to hold this letter in his hands and laugh at it. Now, I don't know what Lincoln did when he held this letter in his hands, but I highly doubt that he laughed at the bulk of the letter when he read it. And the reason I believe that is that most of the letters that Abraham Lincoln received were funneled out to the federal bureaucracy, and they wound up in a different agency or department, and now they're housed at the National Archives in a different record group that pertains to that particular department or agency. The letters that really meant something to Lincoln, he kept. And after he died, they were found in his desk, and they were turned over to his son Robert, and now they're housed at the Library of Congress. And Hannibal Cox's letter is one of those letters among about 20 of the letters from African Americans that Lincoln kept. I think this letter clearly meant something to Abraham Lincoln. Another letter that I think will be familiar to anyone who's gone through this exhibit over here is this letter from Annie Davis, which is, there's an audio version of it, and if you haven't heard it, you've got to go through and hear it. This letter, I think, was discovered originally by my graduate school mentor, Ira Berlin, in the 1980s. Annie Davis was enslaved in Bel Air, Maryland, and she wanted to visit her relatives on the Eastern Shore, but her mistress would not allow her to do that. And with nowhere left to turn, Annie Davis wrote to Abraham Lincoln, and she wanted to know, am I free? Am I a free person who can go visit my relatives without having to ask leave of anybody else? Now, sadly, at the point that she wrote this letter in August of 1864, she was not yet free. Maryland was exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation, so she was still enslaved. But what she didn't know at the time was that Abraham Lincoln had been working behind the scenes for more than a year to try to bring freedom to Maryland. And Maryland would become free a few months later on November 1st, 1864. And at that point, she would be free to visit her relatives without having to ask permission of anyone else. So these are a sample of some of the letters that I found that African Americans wrote to Lincoln, and I gathered these together. I told you I originally wanted to do African American correspondence and conversations with Lincoln. I realized I had way too much for one book, so I got a twofer out of it. And I took the letters and I put them into this book, which is called To Address You as My Friend. And then I took the conversations part and I turned it into A House Built by Slaves. And so what I'm going to do with the rest of my time this evening is tell you some of the stories of the black men and women who came to the White House to meet with the commander-in-chief. Now, one of the things we have to get into our minds to really understand this story is that the White House was a little bit different in the 1860s than it is today. Today, if you want to go to the White House, you've got to go through all sorts of security protocols. It was not like that during the Civil War. Anyone who wanted to could go through the door of the White House, get in line, walk up the stairs, and wait for their turn. And Abraham Lincoln held office hours, just like I do as a college professor. And anyone who wanted to could come and talk to Lincoln about anything that was on their minds. If you've seen the Spielberg-Lincoln movie, you see this really beautifully captured in that scene with the couple from Missouri. And so for the first year of the war, thousands of white Americans come to the White House, wait their turn in line, and then get to go talk to Lincoln about whatever they wanted to. Beginning as early as April of 1862, African Americans claim this privilege as well. And again, for them, they are claiming the White House is our people's house too. We are citizens. We have a right to meet with the president and tell him what's on our mind. One of the first African Americans to meet Abraham Lincoln was this man here, Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was very famous in his day, and I think he's starting to get more popularity in the general public. Apparently, Amazon is making a film about him. Robert Smalls was born into slavery in South Carolina. He was 23 years old in 1862. He had a wife and 2 young kids, and he knew the threat of slave sales that constantly loomed over black families in the South, and he was terrified of the idea of being sold away from his wife and children, and so he wanted to find a way to get out of slavery. He was working essentially as a pilot on this Confederate ship, the CSS Planter, and he hatched a plan with several other friends to steal this ship away from the Confederacy and sail her out to the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this was a very dangerous plan, because first he had to arrange the plan with his friends, and they didn't tell their wives or children because they didn't want word to leak out because that would destroy the plan. Then they had to, at night, sail out of Charleston Harbor and get past the Confederate guards. And then once they get to the Atlantic Ocean, they have to persuade the Union blockading vessels that they aren't Confederates on the attack. And so the night of May 13th, 1862, he and 15 other African Americans board this ship. Again, the women and children don't know what they're doing yet. They start to sail out of Charleston Harbor. And Robert Smalls had made himself look like a captain. He wore some sort of linen coat and a hat that made him look like a captain. And in the dark, the Confederate guards and the forts around Charleston Harbor could not see his skin color. And he did whatever signal a captain would have done to say, "I'm okay," and they let him go. And then he gets out to the Atlantic Ocean, and he makes it to the Union blockading vessels, and he somehow persuades them, "I'm not attacking you," and they take him in. And he travels to the north, and he becomes a hero. Newspapers sing his praises. In August of 1862, he travels to Washington, D.C., where he speaks before this pastor's church, Henry McNeil Turner, at the African Methodist Episcopal Church. A biracial audience of 1,200 people listen to Robert Smalls tell the story of his daring escape. And while he's in Washington, D.C., he makes a visit to the White House. We don't know exactly what was said between Robert Smalls and Abraham Lincoln because the account we get from Smalls came years later and it was not very detailed. But knowing what I know about Abraham Lincoln, I have to think he looked at Robert Smalls and said, "Can you tell me the story? Can you tell me the story about how you stole this ship and earned your freedom?" And you might wonder, why does a meeting like this matter? Well, up until this point in the war, August of 1862, Abraham Lincoln had opposed allowing black men to fight in the Union Army. He said this is a white man's war, it's about Union, it has nothing to do with African Americans. And if that's not enough, what if we put the arms in the hands of black soldiers? They might prove cowardly, and those guns just as quickly wind up in the hands of the enemy. So up until this point, Abraham Lincoln says no black men as soldiers in the Union Army. But Abraham Lincoln listened to Robert Smalls, and here he met a man who had fought for freedom for himself and his family against great odds and with great bravery. And when Robert Smalls left Washington, D.C. and went back to South Carolina, he bore with him a letter from the War Department that authorized the recruitment of black soldiers. And the 1st and 2nd South Carolina colored volunteers were raised that fall. I believe it was a meeting between Abraham Lincoln and a black visitor that led Lincoln to change an important public policy and allow black men to begin serving in the Union Army. Black soldiering became official with the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, and upwards of 200,000 black men joined the Union cause for the last 2 years of the war. And to give you a sense of perspective, that's about 10% of the Union Army. But just because black men are now allowed to enlist in the Army does not mean that they have equality. They enlisted expecting to be paid $13 a month, which is the same amount as a white soldier. Instead, the War Department decided to pay them under the Militia Act of 1862, pay them as laborers. And laborers only got $10 a month, and if that wasn't enough, they had an additional $3 deducted as a clothing allowance. So black men enlist expecting $13 a month, and instead they're getting just over half of that. And if all that isn't bad enough, they're given subpar uniforms and weapons. They're made to do fatigue duty instead of fighting. And if you don't know, fatigue duty is labor that makes you really tired. And the Confederate government puts out a policy that black men captured in uniform will be treated as slaves in insurrection and either sold into slavery or executed. Now, Black men start enlisting in the army, and then they find that they're not getting equal treatment. And many of the letters that they wrote to Abraham Lincoln were about these issues. They made the argument that bullets do not discriminate on account of race, and that if we can be just as likely to be hit as a white soldier, we should get the same pay and the same protections. Now, Frederick Douglass had been enlisting soldiers, including 2 of his own sons in the Union Army, and he was furious that black soldiers were not getting equal treatment as white soldiers. And so in August of 1863, he returned through the state of Maryland, which he had not visited since he had escaped from slavery in the 1830s, and he showed up at the White House, uninvited and unannounced. And he didn't know if he would be welcomed in or turned away, but he got in line and he waited his turn, and he was actually allowed to go in a little bit early. And when he walked into Lincoln's office, he tried to introduce himself. And Lincoln went up to him and shook his hand and said, "Oh, I know who you are." And Lincoln then took him by the hand and led him over to a seat. And the 2 men sat down together. And Douglass pressed Lincoln on these issues of equal pay and Confederate atrocities. On the issue of equal pay, Lincoln said political sentiment in the North would not allow for black men to get the same pay as white soldiers. He said it would eventually come, but the time had not yet come. And besides that, slaves who become free should consider some sort of monetary value in that, and so they should take that for what it is. On the issue of Confederate atrocities, Lincoln said that he did not believe it would be right to execute Confederate POWs who had not committed a war crime. But he did believe if they captured a Confederate soldier who had committed a war crime, that they should be punished. Now, if you know anything about Frederick Douglass, you might gather that he was not altogether satisfied with these answers. Douglass wanted action now. But Douglass went away from this meeting with a new appreciation of the political realities facing Lincoln, and also with an appreciation that Lincoln treated him as a man and treated him as an equal, that Lincoln shook his hand, which is something that most white Americans never would have done with an African American. And a few months later, Douglass went to New York City and he gave a speech, and he said, "I have been to the White House, and as you were not there, I suppose you would like to know how a black man was greeted by the President of the United States." And Douglass paused, and then he said, "He greeted me as you have seen one gentleman greet another." And then Douglass said, to the great delight of the audience, "I felt big there." Now, so far I've told you about 2 very famous people. Douglass, of course, I think is the most famous African-American of the 19th century. Robert Smalls would go on to serve 10 years in Congress during Reconstruction. But I want to tell you about some people who are less famous. This is Alexander T. Augusta. Alexander Augusta was born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1825. He was born into a free black family, and his family left Virginia in the early 1830s. And my hunch is it was in the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion when Virginia authorities really clamped down on enslaved people and free African Americans. So his family moves to Baltimore, where Augusta becomes a barber, which was a respectable middle-class profession for a young black man. But Augusta really wanted to be a doctor. And so he applied to the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and he was denied admission on account of the color of his skin. And so he moved to Toronto, where he attended Trinity Medical School and became a medical doctor. Over the next 6 or so years, in the mid-1850s and into the 1860s, he practices medicine in Toronto and trains other young black men to become physicians. After Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Augusta sent this letter to Abraham Lincoln. And on the first page, he describes how he had to leave the United States to become a doctor. And at the top of the second page, you'll notice that he says he now wants to be of some use to his race. He wants to come back to the United States and become an Army doctor. And the War Department extends an invitation, and he travels from Toronto to Washington, D.C. And when he gets there, the examining surgeon looks at him and say he appears to be a person of African descent. And they write to the War Department, the Secretary of War, and ask them to rescind Augusta's invitation. Augusta protests this, and the Secretary of War says, "No, you will examine him." The examining surgeon, a doctor named Cronin, then put Augusta through the hardest medical exam he could come up with. They called it a squeezing process, and Augusta passed with flying colors. Afterwards, the Surgeon General went to the examining doctor and said, "I say, Cronin, how is it that you came to let the N-word pass?" Dr. Cronin said, "The truth is, sir, the N-word," and I'm censoring what they really said, "the N-word knew more than I did, and I couldn't help myself." And so Augusta becomes an Army surgeon, the highest-ranking black officer of the Civil War era. But just because he's now an officer does not mean he no longer faces discrimination. On one occasion in May of 1863, he's traveling through Baltimore, and he gets onto a train on his way to Philadelphia. And he feels someone behind him, and it's a white teenager who rips off his first shoulder strap. And Augusta stands up and turns around to confront this kid, and another white man comes up behind the teenager and rips off his other shoulder strap, and Augusta realizes he's not going to win this fight. So he gets off of the train and goes and finds the local provost marshal, and they go to arrest these assailants. But even in the process of doing that, he gets punched in the face and given a vicious bloody nose. A few months later, he is called to testify before a military court. And on the way, he goes to get onto a streetcar in Washington, D.C., and the conductor says, "You're not allowed to ride on here. You can sit on the front with the driver outside, or you can walk in the muddy streets." And Augusta refused to suffer that indignity. And Augusta took these stories to the newspapers, and newspapers throughout the United States debated them, and in fact, even the U.S. Senate discussed what was happening to this man. And a Democratic newspaper in Indiana very snidely remarked that if Alexander Augusta was unhappy with how he was being treated, he should take it up with his commander-in-chief. Now, I doubt that Augusta read that newspaper because it was in Indiana, but that's actually exactly what he decided to do. In February of 1864, he and another black surgeon, Anderson Abbott, and this was a doctor that he had trained in Toronto, he and Anderson Abbott decided that they would attend a White House reception. The President and First Lady held regular receptions in the evenings, and anyone who wanted to could go and attend. And up to this point, only white Americans had ever done that. But these two men decided, we're going to do this as well. And so they put on their uniforms, they put on their winter wraps, and they walked to the White House. And when they got there, they could hear the music wafting out of the windows, and they were very nervous. We know what happened because Anderson Abbott left an account of it. And they go inside, and they take off their winter wraps and hand them to a servant, and they get in line to shake the president's hand. And when Lincoln saw these two men, Anderson Abbott said that Lincoln eagerly approached them. And Lincoln went up to Alexander Augusta and shook his hand. Now, at that point, Mary Lincoln looks over, and she does not like what she sees. And so she sends her son Robert over, and Robert goes to his father and says, "Are you really going to allow this innovation?" And Lincoln turns to his son and says, "Why not?" And at that, Robert slinks back over to his mother, and Lincoln turns back to Alexander Augusta, shakes his hand again, and then shakes Anderson Abbott's hand. And the two men then go into the East Room of the White House, and they walk around. And the way that Abbott described it, you can imagine their adrenaline was pumping. He said that they tried to pretend like they were looking at the paintings on the wall and enjoying the music, but they were doing everything they could to keep their composure. And as they walked through the East Room, the great crowd of white people formed a hollow circle around them. And as they moved, that hollow circle moved. And one man who was there that night was Lincoln's private secretary, William Stoddard. And William Stoddard later wrote about this scene. He said it was a practical assertion of Negro citizenship for which few were prepared. And then he said, seeing these two men there, he said, was as good as a play. Now, that was a practical assertion of African American citizenship. They just walked in and said, we deserve to be here. But some of Lincoln's black visitors made explicit claims of citizenship. In January of 1864, a group of Creoles in New Orleans wrote this proclamation or this petition to Lincoln and Congress calling on the right to vote. It was signed by over 1,000 people. 28 of the signatories were elderly men who were veterans of Andrew Jackson's army during the War of 1812. Creoles are light-skinned people of African, English, Spanish, French descent. These were very wealthy people. They were educated. They paid taxes. They had military service. And so in this petition, they make the claim that we should have the right to vote because of who we are in society. And the first two signatories, Arnold Burtnow and a friend of his, show up at the White House in March of 1864 and present this petition to Lincoln. And Lincoln sits down with them in the White House and looks it over, and he agrees you should have the right to vote. And there were some white men in the room in Lincoln's office on that day, and one of the witnesses said their senses were given a great shock by this. And Lincoln agreed you should have the right to vote, but as president, I don't have any control over the right to vote. That's controlled at the state level. But if you can find a way to connect black suffrage to winning the war, then maybe I, as president, can do something about it. And these two men went away. They spent the next week and a half in Washington, D.C., and while they were there, they wrote out a new petition. And this is it here. And they changed what they asked for in this new petition. In the first petition, they asked for the right to vote for light-skinned people of African descent who were born free, who are educated, who are taxpayers. But they changed their argument. They said that now they believed all black men should have the right to vote, regardless of how dark their skin color was, regardless of whether they were born free. And here's the argument they made. They said that expanding suffrage in this way, and these are their words up there, would give full effect to all the Union feeling in the rebel states in order to secure the permanence of the free institutions and loyal governments now organized therein. In other words, they recognized that when Reconstruction came, the white South would be brought back into the Union. And most of the white South had been Confederate. And if you want free institutions to survive, you cannot only allow ex-Confederates to vote. And hey, there's been a loyal population in the South for the last 4 years. And guess what? They were all enslaved, but they're loyal to the Union cause. Give them the right to vote. That is how you secure the permanence of free institutions. Now, I can't prove this, but I think that they returned to the White House on March 12th and presented this new petition to Lincoln. And the very next day, Lincoln wrote a letter to the governor-elect of Louisiana. And it was a private letter, but Lincoln wrote this: I barely suggest for your private consideration whether some of the colored people may not be let in, that is, let into the franchise. As, for instance, the very intelligent, meaning the educated, and especially those who have fought gallantly in our ranks. And in this next sentence, which is pure Lincoln, you can see how he has listened to his black visitors and adopted their idea. Lincoln says they would probably help in some trying time to come to keep the jewel of liberty within the family of freedom. In other words, Lincoln and these black visitors could foresee that Reconstruction might not go so smoothly. It might be messy. And if you want to preserve the jewel of liberty, the best way to do that is to bring African Americans into the body politic. Lincoln would spend the next year working behind the scenes to fight for black suffrage. And this is a great change in Lincoln's thinking because as a young man, Lincoln had mocked the idea of black men voting. But now he comes out working behind the scenes, and in the last speech he ever gave on April 11th, 1865, Lincoln publicly advocated for some black men to have the right to vote, and in the audience that night was a young actor named John Wilkes Booth. And when John Wilkes Booth heard that, he said that means N-word citizenship. By God, that'll be the last speech he ever gives. Again, it was meetings with African Americans that helped push Lincoln on these issues. I don't have a photograph of the next person I want to tell you about, but I do have an image of the room that she appeared in, and the room is important. Caroline Johnson was a woman from Philadelphia, my hometown, and she had worked as a nurse for convalescing Union soldiers, but she was a talented artist. And in 1864, she wanted to make a gift to thank Lincoln for all he had done for African Americans, and she made a beautiful wax fruit display. It cost her $150 to make. It had a $350 retail value, and that was a tremendous amount of money back then. And Caroline Johnson got a letter of introduction from someone in the Interior Department, and on a Saturday in April of 1864, she showed up at the White House and presented this gift to Abraham and Mary Lincoln. And she got to give it to Lincoln in the library, and I think the room really matters. Because most of the meetings that Lincoln had with anybody, white or black, were in public spaces of the White House. But the library was part of the private residence of the first family. And I believe this is probably the first time that an African American was welcomed into the private living space of the first family, other than a servant or a slave. And Caroline Johnson showed up with her Baptist minister, James Hamilton, and Hamilton opened up the conversation by talking about the wonderful changes that had happened over the course of the previous few years. And he thanked Lincoln for emancipation, and then he said perhaps Mrs. Johnson would like to say a few things. And Caroline Johnson was understandably nervous. Here she is standing before the President of the United States, and she looked down at her feet, and she didn't know what to say, but then she felt a great fire burn through her chest. She later said this, "It burned and burned till it went all over me. I think it was the Holy Spirit." And her mind went to the Old Testament prophet of Isaiah chapter 51, where God promises everlasting comfort and salvation to the suffering. Isaiah wrote, "Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness. Look to the rock from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham your father." And with those words in her mind, she looked at Abraham Lincoln and said, "Mr. President, I believe God has hewn you out of a rock for this great and mighty purpose. Many have been led away by bribes of gold, of silver, of presents, but you have stood firm because God was with you. And if you are faithful to the end, he will be with you." And Lincoln thanked her for the beautiful present and talked about the difficulties he had faced, and he, on the verge of tears, says, "Don't give the glory to me, it belongs to God." I'm going to skip that one. Frederick Douglass returned to the White House a few months later, and this meeting is really important. I spent 15 minutes talking about it to my students this morning, but I'll keep it a little bit shorter for you all tonight. As many of you know, the Civil War was going very badly in the summer of 1864. Ulysses S. Grant was stuck outside of Petersburg, Virginia, trying to capture Richmond, and William Tecumseh Sherman could not capture Atlanta. And with Northern morale plummeting because these two great armies were stuck, Abraham Lincoln becomes convinced that he's going to lose in his bid for re-election in November. Now remember that Frederick Douglass had come to the White House uninvited in August of 1863. This time a year later, Lincoln invites him. He summons Douglass to come. And Frederick Douglass comes to the White House, and the two men sit down together, and they talk politics first. They talk about the election of 1864. And then Lincoln looks at Douglass, and he says, "Douglass, I hate slavery as much as you do and want to see it abolished altogether." And Lincoln then explains the problem. The slaves are not running away as quickly as he had hoped they would after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. And once he's out of office in March of 1865, the new president will rescind the Emancipation Proclamation, and the chance for freedom will be gone. And Douglass responds and says, well, the problem is the slaveholders don't tell the enslaved people that they can go to the Union Army, so they don't know to run away. And these two men then sit down together and concoct a plan that Douglass later said was modeled after John Brown, where they would send bands of scouts into the Confederacy telling enslaved people, run away now while you still have the chance, because once Lincoln is out of office, your golden opportunity for freedom will be gone. Now, fortunately, nothing had to come of this plan. Sherman eventually captured Atlanta. Lincoln sailed into re-election. But this moment is really important for how we understand Abraham Lincoln and emancipation during the war. Usually when we talk about emancipation, we talk about how Lincoln justified it as a war measure, a military necessity for saving the Union. But the plan that Lincoln and Douglass came up with on this day in August of 1864 had nothing to do with saving the Union or winning the war or military necessity. It had everything to do with making freedom available to as many people as possible before Lincoln was out of office. And I believe that this meeting transformed the way Frederick Douglass thought about Abraham Lincoln. Douglass later said, what he said on this day showed a deeper moral conviction against slavery than I had ever seen before in anything spoken or written by him. The following month, the Baltimore ministers, black ministers of Baltimore, brought a beautiful pulpit Bible to Lincoln as a gift to thank him for emancipation. And a month after that, Sojourner Truth came to the White House and sat down with Lincoln, and Lincoln showed her this Bible. And you can actually visit this Bible today at Fisk University in Nashville at the John Hope and Aurelia Franklin Library. If you're ever there, it is worth going to see. But I want to close by talking about a few other African Americans who met Lincoln on the streets of Washington, D.C., outside of the White House. In May of 1862, Lincoln went to an Army hospital where he greeted convalescing Union soldiers. And when he got there, a white nurse introduced him to 3 black fugitives from slavery who were working as cooks for the Army. And when Lincoln met these 3 people, he shook each of their hands and said, "How do you do, Garner? How do you do, Brown? How do you do, Lucy?" What Lincoln didn't see in that moment of human connection was that the white convalescing soldiers behind him were using the N-word to describe these people, and they were in shock that Lincoln would lower himself to talk to these people in the way that he was. But from Lincoln's perspective, they were serving the Union cause, and they deserved the same respect and dignity that anyone else serving the Union cause deserved. Every now and again, Lincoln would stop on his way from the White House to the soldiers' home at a contraband camp near where Howard University is today. And one day, when Lincoln was on his way to the contraband camp, the commander of the camp went to a young black refugee from Maryland named Mary Dines. And he said to Mary, "I want you to lead the people in singing for the president." And if you look at this photograph closely, you'll see that these are the people holding songbooks, preparing to sing for Lincoln. And Mary Dines left a recollection of what happened that day. She stumbled before the people and began singing the first verse of "Nobody knows what trouble I see but Jesus." And she was terrified at singing before the president. She sang the first verse by herself. In the second verse, the other contrabands joined in, and in the end, Lincoln was singing with them. And for an hour, Lincoln sang with these black refugees from bondage. And they finally closed with John Brown's body, and you can imagine Abraham Lincoln belting out, "Glory, glory, hallelujah, his soul goes marching on." And Mary later said she believed that the Holy Ghost was working on him. And Mary left a recollection of what this was like, and one of the things that really stuck out at me about this recollection was she described how different the style of worship was for the black refugees than what Lincoln would have experienced in the Presbyterian church he attended in Washington, D.C. And she expected Lincoln to laugh. But he didn't laugh at these black refugees. He joined in. And there we have that same sentiment that was articulated in Hannibal Cox's letter. These young black men and women expected Abraham Lincoln to laugh at them because he might see them as different. But he didn't. He treated them differently than any president had before, and sadly than any president would for many more years to come. And I think it's little wonder that when Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, African Americans felt a keener sense of loss than white Americans did. They knew that for the first time they had had a friend in the White House, and they didn't know what would happen in the aftermath of his death. And on the day that Lincoln died, hundreds of black women and children gathered outside of the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue, in Gideon Wells's words, weeping and mourning their loss. This is a story that has been lost for 160 years. When Booker T. Washington was invited to the White House in 1901 to have dinner with Teddy Roosevelt, Southern newspapers protested the unprecedented nature of inviting a black man to the White House for a meal. People had forgotten just 40 years later what it had been like during Lincoln's administration. And it's a story that I think is important for us in our time to remember. And so I thank you for coming out to hear me tell about it. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Dr. Ed Ayers.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many old friends in such a wonderful place that does such good work every day, explaining the hardest thing in American history to students of all ages, making Richmond, Virginia, the best place in the United States to understand the defining event of our nation. So, John, that was wonderful. So it raises one obvious question. What took so long for us to see this story? Why are you just now telling this?
This is a book that I couldn't have written 20 years ago, and Ed, I should point out, is a pioneer in digital humanities. And the advent of digital humanities is the sort of thing that makes so much scholarship possible today that we couldn't have done in the 90s when I was in college. digital newspapers were very hard to find, and if you wanted to look at a newspaper, you had to go down to the microfilm room and scroll through and hurt your eyes. And now anyone with a computer and a subscription to newspapers.com can go in and find incredible sources. So a lot of the stories that I found in the book are stories that I was able to find as a result of being able to do searches in digital newspapers. I'm part of a group of faculty at Christopher Newport called the Center for American Studies, and we have student research assistants who we pay, and so I would give them names and keywords, and I would say, go in and see what you can find. And some of the stories that I have are things that my students found for me. And with the letters of Abraham Lincoln, there's a group in Illinois digitizing every letter Lincoln received or wrote. And I was able to go through those and look. And so using all of these different sources, many of them digital, I was able to pull together and piece together this story that I couldn't have done a generation ago.
So that's compelling, but it's also the case that other people have had access to these resources and have not imagined this book. How was it that you came to think that this was a story that needed to be told?
Yeah, it's funny how you start off with one question sometimes when you're working on a book, and then you go different directions. So a long time ago, 8 years ago, I guess, I was planning to write a history of the slave trade during the Civil War. And I started doing searches in the letters, looking for letters of slave traders who were writing to Lincoln seeking pardon. And that's when I began to find these letters from African Americans. And as I was finding these letters from African Americans, I thought, wow, some of these have been published by the University of Maryland, but most have not been, and these deserve a wider audience.
You found exactly the opposite of what you were looking for.
I did. That's exactly right. You go from slave, and I still
don't reveal. That's what historians are like. We always know exactly what we're doing.
Well, I still published a slave trading book in August, but it took a while to get back to it. Because I became intrigued by this, and as I began looking at these letters, I began to realize that many of them had been personally given to Lincoln, and so I wanted to find these conversations. And so it was starting at one point, and then moving to another, and then another, that I finally realized I could write an entire book on Black visitors to the Lincoln White House. And I think that the moment, in some ways, was maybe not ready for a book like this, because I'm very, in the book, I'm critical of some big thinkers in our culture on how they think about Abraham Lincoln and race. And yet, on the other hand, I think the moment is right for a book like this, because we are having so many discussions of race in America, and we need to have a better understanding and a more complex and more complete understanding of how race has functioned in American history. And this has been a part of the story that maybe scholars just haven't wanted to look for, and maybe I was just open to looking for it, or maybe I just stumbled upon it. But either way, I let the sources take me to where they went. And it was astounding that Lincoln did what he did. One of the things I do in the introduction is I show how most white Americans would not have shaken a black person's hand. And I give accounts of people who met Abraham Lincoln, who shook his hand, who met other white abolitionists who refused to shake their hands. And that says something important about who Abraham Lincoln was. And that kind of goes against the scholarly grain of how we often think about Abraham Lincoln. But I went with what the sources, where they took me. And I will say, Lincoln has his faults. He is not perfect. I have 3 chapters on colonization, and I go after Lincoln for his approach to African Americans and colonization in those chapters. But a lot of the people who write about Lincoln and race today, they focus on that, and they leave out the rest of it. So my hope is to give a more complete understanding of Lincoln, as we would say, warts and all, as Cromwell said, and recognize what he did that was great. And look to it as a model, I think, of something that I wish more of our presidents had done.
So why do you think it is that, really, ever since Lincoln's assassination, there's been a tradition of great skepticism of the sincerity of his beliefs and in the equality and freedom of black people? Why has that been a persistent strain in American history?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the language of the Emancipation Proclamation and the way that it functioned. Richard Hofstadter, very famously in the 1940s, said it had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. And that's not a high compliment. And that has been very influential on how scholars think about the Emancipation Proclamation, and then how their students do and how teachers do. And so when I do a lot of programs for high school teachers, I've done them here every summer for the last number of summers. I've done them in Chesapeake. I've done them all over the country, in fact. And it astounds me how skeptical people are of Lincoln. And part of it is we're skeptical of the idea of a great white man. And part of it is, I think, we're just a more cynical generation. I think that might be part of it. And I think part of it is we, of course, read history through the world in which we live. And so we look at the issues confronting our society today, and I think that gives us a less positive view on where we came from at times. And so for all these reasons, when I talk to high school teachers, I always, hear negative things about Lincoln. I rarely hear them. If I say, what's your thought if I say Lincoln and race or Lincoln and emancipation? Or sometimes I twist the question. I say, what would your students say? And I get words like hypocrite or cynical or he only did it to save the Union. And he justified emancipation in that way. He said, I'm doing this as a military measure. And so that colors the way we think about it. But then I tell the story of Frederick Douglas, and that meeting shows that for Lincoln, it was not just about winning the war. There was a moral dimension to it, and we need to recapture that.
So why do we need a more humane and generous understanding of Lincoln?
It's a great question. And I think we need a more humane and generous understanding of our neighbors. And if we lived in a culture that was more forgiving, we would be in a happier culture. I'm not a sociologist. I shouldn't be saying these things. But my approach to history is the same way. I try to remember that these are people. They are human beings who had flaws, just like I have flaws. It's so easy for us to look at the speck in our neighbor's eye and forget the plank in our own. And that's especially true when we look at historical figures. And so one of the things I often try to do with my students is get them to understand that Abraham Lincoln died in 1865. He did not know what the world was going to look like in 2023. And for us to expect him to hold him to certain standards that he never could have imagined, we would never want ourselves to be held to standards from 200 years from now, because we don't know what they are. And so I think recapturing the humanity of figures like Lincoln is helpful for us to understand who they were and why they acted the way they did and how they got us to where we are today. But then it can also help us to, I think, appreciate more about the struggles that our leaders face. It's so easy to Monday morning quarterback our leaders and say, why didn't they do this or why didn't they do that? And so many people today, why didn't Lincoln free the slaves in April of 1861? He could have done it. And people say that. And well, there's good reasons for that. And if we can recapture the complexity and the humanity of the moment, I think it can give us a deeper understanding of him as a person and also history more broadly and how we fit into it.
You don't really beat up on Lincoln for colonization. You're generous to him all the way through. You tell the truth, but you understand why he was saying the things that he does.
Yeah.
What difference did it make that he shook people's hands in the White House and accepted these beautiful gifts of waxroots? A wonderful story that you tell. Did it change anything? People sometimes want to know about historians. What difference does it make if we know? What difference does it make that we know that Lincoln shook the hands of black men and women in the White House?
It tells us something very important about him as a person. Because we have to realize that there was nothing to be gained by doing that. And this showed up in the newspapers, and the newspapers were partisan. So if you were in a mid-sized city, there were two newspapers. There was a Republican newspaper and there was a Democratic newspaper, and you read the paper of your party. And what's fascinating is these stories circulate about Lincoln shaking black hands. And when Northern Democrats read these things, they're horrified. How can Lincoln be doing this? And when these things also appear in Southern newspapers. I just came across a diary a couple months ago that I wish I had had in time for the book, where a woman from North Carolina writes about reading about Lincoln shaking the hands of African Americans at a reception. Actually, it was Alexander Augusta and Anderson Abbott. And for white Southerners, this justifies secession in their minds. And so the fact that Lincoln was willing to do this when he had nothing to gain by it, it speaks to the sincerity of his action. Lincoln was a brilliant politician, And he knew how to play politics, and he plays politics throughout his adult career. In this moment, he's not playing politics.
Matter of fact, he's doing the opposite.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not going to gain nearly as many votes from his parties. He's going to lose from the people who might vote for him, right?
That's right.
That's one of the things that people don't understand generally is that you mentioned that Sherman taking Atlanta, and I would argue Sheridan taking the Valley.
I know. As I said that, I thought I should have mentioned
Thank you. That's important.
I did.
And that determines the war, but Lincoln only wins 1% more votes in 1864 than he had in 1860. And so that, that he's on thin ice, and to spend or at least risk political capital by doing something that, already the people who are against slavery are going to vote for him anyway, right? So the only explanation would be is that this is sincerity and humanity.
It's who he was.
Yeah. So let me ask you, since we teach critical thinking skills, I wouldn't want people to think that I'm just going to not argue with you about anything. Let me ask you this. Do you worry that these stories were embellished or remembered more positively than they were? Because after his death and after the end of slavery, a lot of people had incentive to claim yes.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with, the texture of the record and make sure you're getting it right?
Yeah, it's a hard question. And what I tried to do as much as possible was rely on sources as close to the original event as possible. And the only time that I'm not able to do that is a story at the very end of the book that's actually kind of captured by this scene where a black woman shows up at the White House on April 14th, 1865, and needs help, and the guard tries to kick her out, and she winds up getting to meet Lincoln, and he says, come back tomorrow and I'll help you, and then she shows up the next day, and he's been killed. And, it's a great story. Carl Sandburg told it with great pizzazz, and it may not be true, and I wouldn't even be surprised if it's not true, if it's apocryphal. I did a lot of searching, and I could not find any account. She said her husband was in the Army. I couldn't find any account of a man with her last name that fit the description. I couldn't find anything earlier than, I think, 1901 for that story. And so in that case, I made it very clear in the telling that this may not be true. Every other story, I think, is based on records from within weeks of when it happened. And some of them are complicated. So I showed the picture of Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth's meeting is very controversial because there's disagreement about how Lincoln treated her when she showed up at the White House. Sojourner Truth showed up with an abolitionist named Lucy Coleman, and Lucy Coleman hated Abraham Lincoln. And in 1891, I think it was, Lucy Coleman published a memoir where she talked about how condescending Lincoln was to Sojourner Truth, and he was really rude to her, and she quotes Lincoln as saying all these terrible things about African Americans. And a lot of historians for the last generation or two have relied on that 1891 memoir. Well, it turns out that now Sojourner Truth could not write herself, but she dictated a letter that was published. She met Lincoln October 29th, 1864. She dictated a letter that appeared in the Liberator newspaper in November of 1864. And Lucy Coleman, the white abolitionist who hated Lincoln, wrote a letter in November of 1864 describing the meeting. And what was interesting about these is they gave a totally different picture of Lincoln's interaction. And Lucy Coleman in this 1864 letter is very upfront. I don't like Abraham Lincoln, and if I could vote, I wouldn't vote for him. But she described Lincoln as being kind towards Sojourner Truth. And that's certainly how Sojourner Truth described him. Sojourner Truth described Lincoln as being like a friend. And so as much as possible, I try to find corroborating sources and figure out what's most reliable. And as much as possible, if there's sources from the war years versus sources from later years, I tried to go with the sources that were closer to the fact.
So I'll ask you one more question before I throw it open. That's kind of a warning to be gathering yourself for really good questions. What would you want the young people who come to this museum to take away? What do they need to know about the American Civil War?
I think the first thing they need to know, and they'll learn it, is that it was about slavery. I remember listening to an episode of Backstory when it was with the history guys. I think it was a while back.
Podcast that we did back in the day, yeah.
And I remember once you interviewing someone, and he started talking about how slavery wasn't the cause of the war. And you just had such great poise, and you just responded and said, I got to stop you there and tell you that actually it was about slavery. And it's interesting to me. I think students more and more gather that, but not all. I remember teaching a class probably 6 or 8 years ago, and I talked about the Cornerstone Address. And then I had a student come up to me after class, and he said, that's interesting because my uncle told me this. And I thought, well, your uncle? Who's your uncle? So you still have to help them understand the causes of the war, and we can't minimize that. And we need to understand, I think, too, the suffering of that generation. And we don't want to do it in a pornographic way. I think too many people to try to get people's attention, like they just get into the grotesque. And I don't think that's the way to do it. And that's not how it's done here. But I think that getting students to understand the human qualities of the war and the suffering of quite frankly, people who were their age can help give them a new appreciation. So every fall, I teach a class at Christopher Newport. It's American Studies 100. It's a class of 99 students, which is very unusual at our school. Most of our classes are very small, but please don't ever let me lose this class. I love teaching 99 students because it energizes me to have a big class in front of me. And the theme of the class is the Declaration of Independence. And we look at how the Declaration has been interpreted by different reform movements over periods of American history. So we spend a lot of time on the founding, on slavery and emancipation. Today we did Martin Luther King. Next class we're doing Malcolm X. Then we're turning to women's rights. And so we do this sort of journey through history. And one of the things that I constantly repeat to them is that there are generations that have come before us who have sacrificed a great deal. And in his Lyceum address in 1838, Abraham Lincoln said, you've got to remember the sacrifices of the founding generation, or you're going to take for granted what they gave you, and you're going to lose the liberty that you have. And so when we looked at a picture today of the Little Rock Nine, and it's that iconic photograph of the young black woman going to school, and there's the woman behind her yelling, and another woman scowling at her. And I said to my students, think about what this young woman went through to win for you the right, for the students of color to win the right to be able to go to school. It was not easy for her at 17 to have to brave that storm. And if we take our education for granted, or if we don't vote, we're trampling on the sacrifices of the generations that paid such a dear cost to get them for us. And so in my class, I try to get my students to understand those sacrifices of different generations, to appreciate where we were, how far we've come. We still have more to go, but those sacrifices have given us gifts that we shouldn't take for granted. And so I think that when young people come through this museum and can learn about the human qualities of the war and the great sacrifices of the young people who fought, especially those who fought for the Union and the black soldiers who fought for freedom, that can hopefully give students an appreciation for what they have, and that maybe they'll take life more seriously in a different way.
Great. Okay, that was hard to follow, but I'm sure somebody has a really good question. Let's do that. That's right. Yes. I guess sorry, wait for the microphones, and they're coming to you even as we speak.
Thank you. Is it on?
Yes, it is.
Thanks, Jonathan. Wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thanks.
Can you tell the story briefly of Lincoln choosing Martin Delany rather than Frederick Douglass as the first black commissioned officer in the U.S. Army? And what, if any, ill will Douglass felt about that decision?
So it wasn't so much choosing Delany over Douglass. I mean, Douglass had been promised a commission to go and recruit in the West, in the Western Theater, and then he never got the commission. And I think he was maybe a little miffed by that, but Douglass was also my age. He was a little old to be doing that. So Delany met with Lincoln in February of 1865, and this actually speaks wonderfully to Ed's question about how we know what we know and what we can trust. Delany met with Lincoln and came to the White House, and according to Delany's account, said, I've got this idea for you, And the idea is that we have an all-black army led by black officers, and that'll really bring the rebellion to a close. And according to Delaney's recollection, Lincoln said, "That's exactly what I've been looking for." And Delaney then becomes a major in the Army. And he's actually not the highest. He's the highest-ranking black field officer. Alexander T. Augusta outranked him. He was the highest-ranking black officer of the war. And I remember right before the book went to the printer.
It's when it always happens.
It always happens.
It usually happens right
after. That's right, right after. Right before it went to the printer, an auction came up with a handwritten note that Lincoln had written to get Delaney the commission. And the handwritten note differed just slightly in the language that Delaney put in his memoir. And so I went to the press. I was like, I know I can't change this in the body of the book. Can I at least just change it in the footnote? And they let me do it. And the thing sold for $250,000. I don't know who bought it, but I couldn't afford that. I need a little bit of a pay raise if I could get one.
It was worth it for your footnote to be accurate.
It was, that's right. And so finding that, though, was just, the moment was incredible. But yeah, Delaney is a really incredible figure in the antebellum Civil War and post-war years.
Yes.
I was just wondering if there was kind of more general question. Was there any story that really shocked you that you found, or particularly moved you? Maybe that even didn't make it into the book for whatever reason.
Yeah, there's one that I took out of the book that I regret. There was a young black woman, teenager, named Elizabeth Shorter. She was born into slavery in the Brentwood section of Washington, D.C., and she became free as a result of the D.C. Emancipation Act on April 16th, 1862. And as a young free woman, she needed an income, and so she began working for a shoemaker in the area not far from Ford's Theater. And one night, she's going to bed in the store of the shoemaker, and his name was Frank, and he comes in, and the lights are dark, and she says, "Who's there?" And he sits down next to her, and he says, "It's me, Liz. It's Frank. But you won't tell Lib, will you?" Lib was his wife, in case you weren't sure. "So you won't tell my wife, will you?" And she says, "What do you want?" And he says, "I want to get into bed with you." And she tries to push him away, but the historical record very euphemistically says he persevered, and that this happened several times, and she became pregnant. And this was in 1863. So November of 1863, she delivers a baby, a little girl, Rosalina. And this man, Frank, had said, I'll support your child. But at the very same time that she had the baby, his wife had a baby. And he decided that he was not going to follow through on his word. And so one day, Lizzie Shorter shows up at his house. He had kicked her out of the house, and she shows up, and she goes into the bedroom, and his wife is there nursing her baby, and Lizzie's holding hers. And she says, "Look at me, look at what you've done, and look at my baby." And he looks at his wife, and he says, "Lib, you don't believe this damned black bitch, do you?" And his wife says, "Yes, Frank, I do. For the last few months, you've been very nervous around her." And at that point, he grabs a pistol from his bedside, and he points it at her and threatens to kill her. And his wife takes away the gun and says, "I won't allow you to murder someone over my child." And then Frank lunges at Lizzie Shorter and grabs her by the neck and shoves her against the wall and goes to choke her. And he orders her out of the house, and he says, "Get your things and get out." So she runs out of the house, and later that day she comes back to get her belongings. And when she comes back, the wife, Lib, gives Lizzie Shorter some money and says, "Don't tell anyone about what happened between you and my husband." Well, Lizzie Shorter the next day goes to the courthouse in D.C. and takes her several judges before she finds a judge who's willing to issue a warrant for Frank's arrest for assault. And he retaliates by getting a warrant for her arrest, saying that she stole the money that his wife had given her. And he goes to trial in June of 1864, and she actually testifies at the trial, but the jury doesn't believe her, and he's acquitted. She goes to trial in October of 1864, and she is found guilty of larceny, stealing the money that the wife had given her, and she's sentenced to 1 year in prison. She is sentenced to prison on November 3rd, 1864. On November 4th, 1864, she writes a letter to Abraham Lincoln, and she was not literate, so someone else wrote it, and then she marks it with an X, and she describes what had happened to her. And on November 5th, 1864, Abraham Lincoln got this letter, he read it, he turned it over, he wrote the word "Pardon A. Lincoln, November 5, 1864. And this is an extraordinary moment. Because one, I think this is the fastest presidential pardon Lincoln ever gave. I mean, the letter's written November 3rd, he gets it the 4th or 5th. We don't know exactly what day, the letter's written November 4th. He either gets it the 4th or the 5th, and he pardons her before she can even be sent to Albany Penitentiary. She was going to be sent to New York. And I didn't even tell you one of the most tragic parts. Her baby died while she was undergoing the trial. So Lincoln looked at this woman and recognized that she had been wronged. And Lincoln had a tremendous sense of justice, especially when it came to matters of sexual impropriety. In the 1830s, Lincoln wrote a poem. It says, "Whatever spiteful fools may say, each jealous ranting yelper, no woman ever played the whore unless she had a man to help her." Now, every time I go to the Lincoln Memorial, I look up to see if they've carved that on the walls, and they haven't done that yet. But it gives you a sense of Lincoln's sense of justice, that when there's infidelity or promiscuity, women are treated differently than men. And Lincoln knew that was unjust. And Lincoln knew that it was unjust that Lizzie Shorter was treated differently than the man who had assaulted her. And he did what he could to save her from worse injustice. And to bring it all back to how remarkable this moment is, November 5th, 1864 is 3 days before Lincoln is about to stand for re-election in what I think is the most important presidential election in American history. And so he takes the time out of his day to save the life of this young black teenager who has been horribly wronged. And I wrote that up and I put it in the book. And then for some reason, I decided, I think, my editor was saying the book was too long and I needed to cut it a little bit. And I thought, well, she's not a black visitor, so maybe I cut it. And in hindsight, I kind of regret cutting it. I've actually done a lot more research on her, and I've written a 4,000-word essay about it. And believe it or not, Ed, I have shopped this thing to a lot of literary magazines, and I can't find anyone who wants to publish it. And it boggles my mind because it's such an incredible story.
That's because they knew it would be such a powerful story tonight for us to be told in that way, and it really was. That's right. That's good. Another question? Yes.
Yes, thank you both for your lives of interpreting and discovery history. And recently I reread Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, which is a story about the future and burning books. And in looking at current events and some things that are going on in local school boards, can you give us an optimism that we are not moving towards a system of eliminating scholarly or revisionist interpretation of history?
It's a tough question. I'm not sure I can provide any optimism, but what I encourage teachers to do when I meet with them during workshops is to use primary sources as much as possible. I think primary sources are a wonderful way to get students to learn hard aspects of history and to learn how to think critically about them. And so in my teaching at Christopher Newport, I actually don't assign anything by scholars. I only assign primary documents. And my hope is that students will learn how to engage in the past. And I think the more that we can get teachers and students reading primary sources, they can be the avenue for approaching hard topics. So today my students read the I Have a Dream speech, in my one class, and they read the Dred Scott decision in my other class. And next class, my students are going to read Malcolm X in one class, and they read Lincoln in another. And having the students read those documents, I think, is the best way not only to approach hard topics, but also to bring history alive. If you can get the students to realize that these aren't just words on a page, but that a living, breathing human being sat down and wrote these things, and that, you know, when I have my students read on the first day of class, I do a lecture on the life of Abraham Lincoln. And I talk about the times he almost died and his love life and all the things that went wrong. And I bring them up to a point where then I assign a reading that they're going to read from that point in Lincoln's life. And my hope is that it humanizes him. And I think the more that our museums like this do this so well, the more that our public history and our academic historians and our teachers can bring history to life and bring the humanity out. And again, I think using primary sources is one of the most effective ways to do that. I think we can kind of do an end run around some of the criticisms of approaching difficult topics, because you're saying, hey, we're analyzing this document. But the other thing I'll say about that is I think it's important to assign documents that don't just offer one perspective. And so I have my students read Dred Scott, and then I have them read Frederick Douglass, and I have them read Abraham Lincoln, and they get 3 perspectives on the Constitution and slavery. And don't tell them, this isn't broadcast live, right? I'm giving an exam next week, and one of the questions is going to be for them to talk about, was the Constitution pro-slavery or anti-slavery? And they'll have read about 5 perspectives, and I don't care what perspective they take, as long as they can make a good argument. And so teaching students how to do that, I think, is a way to try to get around some of these issues.
And I would say the secret is that it's not that hard to get students engaged if you give them a chance.
Yeah.
And these primary their innate curiosity is strong. They want to understand these things. So I think that if they're not going to settle for not learning all that they can. I think we have a misconception that somehow teaching history is forcing boring stuff on kids who don't want it. They're hungry. And all you have to do is come to this museum and watch their faces as they confront these things, and you'll have more hope, because they are hungry to understand. And they understand that their own lives are only going to make sense if they understand where they fit into the story. And not everybody's going to be fortunate enough to take John's class, which I'd like to. That sounds great. But they can come to this museum. They can see a video. They can tell their friends. So this curiosity and determination to try to connect with the past is innate. All we have to do is sort of open the gates. I think maybe we'll stop for the evening, if that seems okay with you. Is there any boss? There's one more question I hear would be fine. I see on both sides. I demand that there be one more excellent question. Who might have it? Yes, in the back. Wait just 1 second.
The mic.
Thanks.
I actually have a couple of questions. I can't imagine that President Lincoln would refer to these formerly enslaved people as African Americans.
No, he didn't. I was paraphrasing that one time when I said that.
So what was the actual language that he used? And I'd also like to say that I'm a former reporter with the Richmond Free Press, and I now own a national news wire that goes to Black-owned newspapers around the country. I would love to publish our story on Ms. Shorter.
All right.
Thank you. So the most common words that they would have used would have been Negro or colored. There's debate over how frequently Lincoln used the N-word. There are 37 documented cases where Lincoln used that word. Most of the instances when Lincoln used the N-word, he was quoting someone else. A few of them were in telling a bawdy joke, which Lincoln did a lot of. And one of the things that's interesting about thinking about the use of the N-word is, even though Lincoln used it, he used it sparingly compared to his political opponents. And so if you ever read through the Lincoln-Douglas debates, you'll see Lincoln use it a couple times. You'll see Stephen Douglas use it a lot of times. And so, but yeah, those would have been, or black. They would have said that as well. Black, colored, and Negro would have been the most common. The N-word, though, is ubiquitous in 19th century writings. And you read newspaper, not so much in Republican newspapers, although sometimes mostly in Democratic newspapers of the era, when they refer not only to African Americans, but also to Republicans, white Republicans, they use the N-word to refer to them or call them. Actually, Frederick Douglass used the phrase, he referred to the Republican Party as the N-word party in a letter he wrote in October of 1964. But yeah.
So how do you deal with that with your students?
I censor the word now. I still assign it in reading. So they're going to read Letter from Birmingham Jail next week. And Martin Luther King Jr. uses the N-word in that letter. And candidly, prior to the murder of George Floyd, I read that long run-on sentence by Martin Luther King and used that word because King used it for a reason. But quite frankly, there was a professor at UCLA who was fired for reading that very same passage, and I kind of decided 3 years ago that even though I have tenure, I'm not going to go there. And so it loses. I think some of King's language loses some of the punch, but for the sake of the class, I've decided not to.
Do you tell the students that I'm not going to say this?
I kind of wing it every time. So I'm not. I think sometimes I think I've usually said it after I get to it. I just sort of pause for a moment and then keep reading.
Yeah, students like to know, what decisions do you have to make to tell the truth and to teach this?
Today we talked about Ruby Bridges, and there's this incredible Norman Rockwell painting called "The Problem We All Live With," and it shows Ruby Bridges being escorted to school by 4 U.S. Marshals. And on the wall behind her, the N-word is spray painted. And so I preemptively, I asked the students to talk about, what do you see in this painting? But before I did that, I say, you'll notice the N-word is spray painted on the wall, because I didn't want a student to just say, oh, that's, so I tried to preempt that in a sense. So I kind of deal with it in different ways depending on the class or the topic.
But the thing is that it is a class. They trust you. It is a community of learning.
Right.
They're there for this purpose. It's one of the safe places that you can actually talk about some of the hardest things in American history. So, you and I both have chosen to write about hard things for a living, Why would you do that? This will be my final question to you. Of all, I can tell that you're idealistic yourself. You're optimistic. Why would you choose to talk about these hard things every day?
Well, I'll tell you, my next book's going to be a kid's book. It's coming out in April. It doesn't have the hard things in it. It's about Lincoln as a child.
But you've written a lot of books before.
I have. I think it's important. And so I started college as a business major because I wanted to make a lot of money. And I still would like to make a lot of money. I just haven't chosen that profession now. And I took a history class as a freshman in college, 250 students. I sat in the front row. Kind of class where in those days we put our social security number on our exams, and that's how we were identified when the TA graded it. And I took this class, and I remember calling my parents and saying, I want to switch from business to history. I want to be a teacher. And my mom had been a high school math teacher from the early 60s to the late 90s, and she had seen such a change in what it was like to teach. She said, if you do that, we'll no longer help you pay for your education. And I called her bluff. And they didn't pull out the rug from under me. I then went to meet with Gary Gallagher and told him what I wanted to do. And he said, let me give you some advice. Get a real job and do history on the weekends. And I didn't take that advice because I love it. And part of it is I want other students to appreciate it too. I had a student come into my office hours today who said, you really get excited about what you teach. I wish I had something in my life that made me that excited. And so I said, sit down, what do you want to do with your life? And we talked for a while about, how can you get to where you might feel this much passion about something that you do? But it's not just because I love it, but because it's important and because it can change the way that people think. And I think that's, the thing I try to get my students to do is to approach class with an open mind. And again, I always choose readings that disagree with one another. And I try to get them to think critically and get them to come to their own conclusions. And I tell them, in my Constitution class, I don't want you to write what you think I think. I want you to write what you think. And if you can support it with evidence from the reading and from the class, you'll get a good grade. And if I can get them to start to think about hard things, I think it helps them grow, it helps me grow, and quite frankly, I grow through the process of researching and writing and teaching. I learn as much from the experiences I hope my students do.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that you're fully grown now, and we're so grateful for you sharing your frankly inspiring spirit as well as this important work, and congratulations.
Thank you.
With the Lincoln Prize. Thanks so much.